George Washington, the gentle giant of American history, a bedtime story. Chapter 1, A Boy on the Virginia Plantation, 1732 to 1744. Long ago, on a peaceful plantation along the green hills and winding rivers of Virginia, a boy named George Washington was born. The year was 1732, and though the world around him was full of big changes yet to come, the little boy knew only the gentle rhythm of his home. In those early years, George lived with his mother, father, brothers, and sisters on a quiet farm in Westmoreland County. Outside their cozy wooden house stretched forests that whispered to him in the breeze, and bright blue skies that seemed endless to his young eyes. Every morning, sunshine would pour across his windowsill as he woke, and every evening, a warm golden light would stretch across the hills as he settled to sleep. George was a thoughtful, gentle boy with bright blue eyes and a curious spirit. From his earliest days, he loved to explore the green pastures that surrounded the house. He would wander carefully along deer trails beneath shady oaks and maples, his hands brushing the soft moss and feeling the rough bark of mighty trees. Every sound, the murmur of the river, the rustling of birds in the bush, made him smile. The house was always alive with small, comforting noises. A kettle whistled as mother prepared tea. Brothers and sisters laughed in the next room. And in the evening, when the fire was lit and the lanterns glowed, George would listen as his father told stories about brave sailors and far-off lands. The firelight would dance across their faces, and George would stare into the orange flames and dream of the world outside their plantation dot as he grew. George's parents could see in him a serious boy, kind but determined, who was always ready to help. He loved riding on his father's horse as they crossed the fields together. Sometimes they would stop by the riverbank, so George could feel the smooth stones beneath his fingers and toss them into the water with a gentle splash. Always do. "What is right?" his father would say in a quiet voice as they gazed at the sunset. George listened carefully, his small hands folded in his lap, and tucked these words into his heart forever. One story that everyone loves to remember is about George and the little cherry tree. Late one summer day, when the birds were drowsy and the air smelled sweet with grass and sunshine, George was given a small hatchet. Excited, he began to practice swinging it at twigs and branches. But one swing went too far and nicked a beautiful cherry tree his father loved. When his father found the wounded tree, his brow furrowed. "Do you know who cut the cherry tree?" he asked. George paused. His hands felt heavy and his heart thudded in his chest. Finally, he looked up into his father's kind eyes and spoke honestly. "I cannot tell a lie. I did it with my hatchet." At this, his father smiled. "I'd rather lose the tree than my son's honesty," he said warmly, patting George on the shoulder. That gentle moment stayed with him forever. Honesty, like a strong tree, was something to be cherished and nurtured. And so the days passed slowly, like a soft, warm breeze blowing across the hills. George learned the value of hard work as he helped in the gardens and the barn, feeling the rich, dark soil in his hands and seeing the crops grow taller with every season. There was joy in these simple things, sharing a smile with his mother as they gathered vegetables, or leaning against the wooden fence to watch the sheep graze at dusk at night. As the crickets began their sleepy song and the stars twinkled far above, George would curl up in his small bed. The gentle light of the moon would spill across the floor, and outside, the forest would grow hushed and still. His thoughts would drift like a quiet river from the day's lessons to the stories his father told by the fire, to the dreams he held close in his heart. And oh, those dreams. Even then, though he was just a boy, George wondered what life might hold for him. Would he ride across the hills forever, or perhaps explore new places beyond the plantation? Would he grow into a strong, kind leader like his father, or become someone who traveled the world and helped others? Only time would tell. But for tonight, there was nothing more important than resting his eyes and listening to the gentle lullabies of his peaceful home. And so, tucked warmly beneath his blankets, George Washington would close his eyes and sink into the most peaceful of sleeps, surrounded by the gentle hum of crickets and the soft breath of the forest outside. Chapter 2, Lessons Learned 1745-1748. As George grew a little taller and a little older, life on the plantation began to change in gentle ways. The hills and trees were the same, the skies still painted with pinks and golds at sunset, but George's days were becoming busier. It was time for him to begin his schooling, and with it came new lessons that would shape the kind of person he would grow to be. Each morning, long before the sun was high, George would rise from his bed and dress by candlelight. Outside his window, the world was hushed and sleepy. The air was often misty and cool, and sometimes he could see his breath in the dim light as he slipped into his boots. Then he would carefully pack his slate, his quills and ink, and his small collection of well-worn books into a satchel. "Don't forget your scarf, my dear," his mother would say warmly as he headed for the door. She would straighten his collar and kiss him on the forehead. George would smile up at her, feeling loved and safe before stepping out into the crisp morning. The schoolhouse was a short walk away, past wooden fences and dewy meadows where wildflowers nodded their sleepy heads in greeting. George enjoyed this quiet time before lessons began. The world was so peaceful just before the day truly woke up. Birds began to call to each other from the treetops as a sleepy orange light spread across the hills. And when he finally reached the little schoolhouse, George would enter the wooden door and take his seat on one of the long benches. The other children, some his age and some younger, greeted him with sleepy smiles. The schoolmaster was a gentle but firm man named Mr. Williams. He had a way of speaking that was calm and measured, and he liked to begin each morning with a short reading from a book. George listened closely. He loved stories, especially those about travelers, explorers, and leaders who had shaped the world. Mr. Williams noticed George's quiet focus. "You have a fine way of paying attention, George," he would say kindly. "That is the first step toward wisdom." And so George practiced page after page, lesson after lesson. He learned to write neat letters with his quill pen, careful not to smudge the ink as it dried. Numbers and figures were next. They danced across his slate as he solved them one by one. Every evening, by the light of a candle, he practiced his handwriting until it was smooth and strong. Though George was serious and diligent, there was also laughter at school, whispered jokes between friends, little races outside during lunch, games of tag on the grassy hills after lessons were over. It was in these gentle moments that George learned another important lesson, that joy and friendship made every hard task lighter. As the seasons shifted and autumn painted the trees orange and gold, George discovered another kind of education, one found in nature. When school let out early, he would often linger outdoors before going home. He loved to climb up into the arms of a broad oak tree and listen to the forest's murmurs, the breeze in the branches, the chattering of squirrels, and the faraway hum of a river. They were like lessons too, lessons of patience and observation. Sometimes his brothers joined him, and they'd make up little games or pretend they were sailors on a great ship, their hands gripping the branches as if they were ropes at sea. Occasionally, his sister would call up to him, laughing, "Careful up there, George." And George would grin and climb carefully back down, feeling his hands grow stronger and his heart a little fuller with each new day. At home in the evenings, the house glowed warm with lantern light. George would settle at the table to do his homework while his mother read or stitched by the fire and his father checked the accounts. The gentle crackle of the flames and the comforting scent of supper made the room feel safe and welcoming. As George wrote, He thought about the lessons he was learning. Not just lessons on paper, but lessons in honesty and respect, in caring for one another, and in appreciating the world around him. Every so often, his father would look up and smile. "You're becoming a fine young man," he would say warmly. That simple phrase filled George with quiet pride. Like a small light kindled deep inside him, and when he was finally done with his studies for the night, George would help blow out the candles one by one, their tiny flames dancing before they disappeared into soft spirals of smoke. Then came bedtime, his favorite part of the day. The house would grow still as everyone tucked into bed, the only sound the gentle breathing of his family and the distant songs of crickets outside. Beneath his blankets, George would stare up at the wooden beams overhead, thinking about all he had learned that day. He felt his heart full of questions, full of hopes, and full of gratitude for the gentle life that surrounded him. And as his eyelids grew heavy, he would whisper a quiet thank you to the world. Thank you for my school. Thank you for my friends. Thank you for my family and my home. Thank you for every small lesson. And like the soft breeze outside that carried the scent of pine and hay through his window, sleep would wrap around him like a warm, quiet embrace, guiding him into dreams filled with wonder. Chapter 3. The Young Surveyor 1749-1752. As the years passed, George's hands grew steadier, his gaze sharper, and his sense of the world deeper. By the time he was a teenager, the boy who had once been content to listen to his father's stories by the fire had begun to seek stories of his own. The hills and valleys that surrounded his home called to him like an old friend, and George felt a new sense of purpose stirring in his heart. He was nearly 17 when an opportunity arose that would change his path forever, the chance to become a surveyor, someone who measured and mapped the land. In those days, America was still mostly wild and uncharted. Brave men would venture into the forests with nothing but a compass, a wooden staff, and their careful eyes. To map the hills and streams was not only an important job, it was a grand adventure. When his parents heard of this opportunity, they exchanged a few glances filled with pride and worry. "It will be hard work," his father told him, his voice gentle, "and you'll face many long days and nights away from home." George nodded. "I understand, sir," he replied with a small, determined smile. And so, with his parents' blessing, George set out on this new adventure, his satchel packed with parchment, ink, and the tools of his trade. That first morning, as he left home before dawn, George paused on the hilltop that overlooked his family's house. A mist hovered across the meadows, and the air smelled of grass and dew. The house looked small and warm, its windows glowing faintly in the distance. He thought of his mother inside preparing breakfast, and his father stirring the fire. George took a deep breath, feeling both a gentle sadness to leave and a bubbling excitement for what was to come. Then, with one last look at his peaceful home, he began his journey. Surveying took him into places he had never been before. Dense forests where sunlight filtered softly through green canopies, winding rivers that splashed over smooth stones, and hills that rose and fell like gentle ocean waves frozen in time. He learned to navigate by the stars on clear nights and by the moss on tree trunks during misty mornings. Every inch of ground became part of a grand puzzle, and his hands became more skillful as he measured and marked the contours of hills and streams. And oh, the silence of the wilderness. Often, George would stop just to listen, the distant call of an owl, the rustling of deer moving quietly through the underbrush, and the gentle hush of the breeze in the trees. Those peaceful nights were his favorite, when he and his small team would set up camp beneath a shelter of branches. Fire would crackle warmly as they cooked simple meals over its gentle heat, sharing stories and laughter. Above them, the stars glimmered like tiny lanterns scattered across a velvet sky. When the fire burned low and the forest grew sleepy, George would lie back on his bedroll and close his eyes. And even though he was far from home, he felt at peace, surrounded by the gentle, timeless rhythm of the wild world. In the mornings, after a quick breakfast of bread and water and maybe a handful of ripe berries picked from the trail, George would rise and continue his work. Carefully, he would draw maps by hand, his quill gliding over the parchment with precision and care. Each mark was a tiny story. This curve was a sleepy river. That dot was a grand old oak. This straight line was a ridge that rose high enough to see for miles. Piece by piece, his maps began to grow, careful records of a world that felt boundless. And though his hands sometimes ached and his boots were often muddy, George loved every moment of it. The hard work never dampened his spirits. Instead, it filled him with a quiet satisfaction. Every task completed was a small victory. Every hill crossed a gentle triumph. As autumn deepened into winter, the forest began to change. The green of summer gave way to warm reds, oranges, and browns. Leaves fell like sleepy dancers, twirling to the forest floor, and the days grew shorter and cooler. George felt a new kind of strength in himself as he trudged through the crisp air, his breath visible in small puffs before him. Nights were colder now, and as he wrapped himself in his blankets beneath the sheltering trees, he thought of his warm bed at home. But even as he missed it, there was a spark of pride glowing inside him. He was becoming someone who could stand on his own, someone who could care for himself and help others too. And so he kept going, one careful step at a time. One chilly evening, after a long day's work, George sat by the fire and looked up at the dark, star-speckled sky. The forest around him was hushed, and his companions were already asleep, their blankets tucked tight against the cold. He listened to the gentle snap of the fire, to the occasional soft sigh of the wind in the branches, and in that moment of quiet, George thought of all he had seen, the rivers and hills, the bright mornings and the dark nights, and he felt a deep, peaceful sense of belonging. The world was vast and beautiful, and though his maps were just small pieces of it, he was grateful to help trace its shape. Before long, his eyes grew heavy, and he pulled his blanket a little closer around him. The firelight flickered, and a sleepy warmth settled into his bones as he drifted into dreams of new hills to climb and new valleys to discover. Chapter 4, Soldier of the Frontier, 1753 to 1758. By the time George was in his early 20s, the careful, quiet boy who had once studied maps by lantern light had grown into a strong and steady young man. His hands were calloused from years spent working outdoors, and his sharp blue eyes had learned to read every sign the wilderness offered, from the footprints of animals in the soil to the way the wind moved the treetops before a storm. And yet, even as his body grew strong and his skills as a surveyor kept him busy, a new path was unfolding before him, one that would take him beyond maps and hillsides and into a larger story, for whispers of tension were stirring between the colonies and the French, who held lands further to the north and west. Small disagreements had grown into greater troubles as different powers hoped to control these wild territories. And so it was that George was called to serve, stepping into a new role as a soldier of the frontier. The days of peaceful surveying gave way to long march through forests and over hillsides, leading small groups of men who looked up to him. They wore plain uniforms and carried muskets and supplies as they followed George's lead. Across streams and meadows, George felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. Every choice mattered: where they camped for the night, which trail they followed through the hills. But the men trusted him, for his quiet confidence never wavered, even when rain soaked their cloaks or the wind chilled them to the bone. Every evening, as they built their fires beneath sheltering trees, George would take a moment to listen to the forest just as he had as a boy. The gentle rustle of the branches, the distant hoot of an owl, and the orange light of the fire reminded him that even in difficult times, there was beauty and peace to be found. As a soldier, George learned a new rhythm. Days began before the light of dawn, when the mist still clung to the hillsides and the world felt hushed and waiting. Mornings were spent marching in long, steady lines across the countryside, hands gripping their gear and eyes scanning the trail ahead dot by afternoon. They might be scouting a forest edge, checking the ground for tracks, or listening carefully for any distant sound that didn't belong. The sharp snap of a twig, the murmur of unfamiliar voices, and when night fell, they built small fires under careful watch, telling low-voiced stories to chase the dark away. George often sat a little apart, gazing into the flames as they danced and shimmered like tiny golden spirits dot in these quiet moments. His thoughts would turn homeward, to his mother and father, to the gentle hills of his boyhood, and to the sense of belonging he felt beneath a warm roof. And though the nights were cold and the work was hard, those gentle memories kept him company and gave him strength. There were dangers too. Tensions with the French boiled into skirmishes in the deep forests and along icy rivers. Thunderous musket shots shattered the morning air, and George learned the weight of fear and the burden of keeping his men safe. Yet he never wavered. Even in the harshest of moments, his sense of duty burned like a steady flame inside him. He would stand by his troops, help bind their wounds, encourage them onward, and remind them that there was a purpose to all they did, to protect their homes and one another, to bring order to an uncertain land. And often, after the fear had passed and the forest was once again quiet, George would look up through the dark branches at the scattered stars. They glimmered cold and bright, tiny lanterns lighting a path through the endless sky, and somehow the sight of them comforted him, as though they too were keeping watch, gentle and constant. As the years went by, George grew in skill and in respect. The men around him began to see him not just as their leader, but as a steadying presence, someone who could face the unknown with a level gaze and a strong heart. And when they spoke of him by the firelight at night, their hands wrapped around mugs of warm drink, they would smile and say that he was a man as sure and solid as the hills themselves. And so, though these were dangerous and uncertain times, George learned lessons that would shape him forever. Patience, endurance, and the deep, quiet strength that comes from putting others first. These became part of who he was, and when at last he rested his head against his folded cloak each night, surrounded by his comrades and the gentle sounds of the sleeping forest, he knew that each challenge faced was also a step toward becoming the person he hoped to be. And in the gentle dark, under the light of countless stars, George Washington would close his eyes and drift into sleep, his dreams, carrying him onward toward a future as steady and bright as the morning sun. Chapter 5. Martha and Mount Vernon, 1759 to 1774. When the years of marching and soldiering began to quiet, a new and softer chapter in George's life began to unfold, one of warmth, home, and the gentle rhythm of a peaceful life. It was in this chapter that Martha Dandridge Custis would come into his world like a bright, gentle light, bringing with her the happiness of family and the comforts of a true home. George was 27 when he met Martha. She was graceful and kind, with a gentle smile that reached her warm eyes. Martha had been married before and had 2 young children, Jackie and Patsy, who quickly found a kind and caring father figure in George. And so, on a bright day in January of 1759, George and Martha were wed. The air was crisp and clear, and the winter sun shone across the hills as they stood together and spoke their vows. That day was not one of grandeur or show. It was a day full of quiet joy. Friends and family gathered around them as they celebrated with good food and gentle laughter, and at the end of the evening, as the stars glimmered overhead, George took Martha's hand, feeling a deep and lasting peace settle in his heart. Soon after their wedding, they moved to George's home at Mount Vernon, a stately house perched on a hill above the shimmering Potomac River, surrounded by green meadows and broad pastures, with long stretches of forest beyond. It was a place of gentle beauty and warm light. Together, they began to make Mount Vernon a true home. Martha brought warmth to its rooms, decorating with soft fabrics and fragrant flowers cut from the gardens outside. George took care of the land with patience and pride, tending crops, overseeing the horses and cattle, and keeping careful accounts of the farm's work done every morning. When the light broke softly across the river, George rose with a quiet sense of gratitude. The war was behind him for now, and all around him was the gentle hum of life at home, the distant clink of dishes as Martha prepared breakfast, the children's laughter as they ran across the grass outside, the rhythmic sound of birdsong. Filtering in through the windows, seasons passed like pages in a well-loved book dot in spring. Green buds unfurled on every branch, and the gardens burst into bloom. George and Martha would walk together among the neat rows of flowers and vegetables, hands clasped and hearts full. Summer brought long, warm days when George spent his afternoons riding across the plantation or swimming in the river with Jackie and Patsy. Martha would wait on the porch with a gentle smile and a bowl of freshly picked fruit, and when autumn arrived, the hills would turn gold and rust red, and the air would grow crisp and cool. Evenings were spent by the fire with Martha, and the children gathered close, reading aloud or sharing stories of the day dot by winter. When snow covered the hills and ice glistened on the river, the house glowed with firelight and candlelight, a cozy haven against the cold outside dot, and through it all, George felt himself deeply content. Every day spent in honest work and in the company of those he loved most. Of course, life at Mount Vernon was not idle. Managing a plantation was much like commanding an army in its own way. There were decisions to be made, workers to care for, crops to tend, and animals to look after. But George faced these tasks as he always had, with patience and a steady hand. He would rise early to inspect the barns and fields, making sure the horses were well fed and the crops healthy. Sometimes Martha would join him, her hands tucked warmly into the folds of her cloak as they walked the quiet paths together. And at the end of the day, after the work was done and the house grew still, George would sit in his study by the light of a single candle. The soft scratch of his pen as he wrote in his journal was like a gentle heartbeat in the quiet house. Yet even as they savored this gentle life, they could sense that the world around them was beginning to change. Whispered conversations about distant troubles began to drift across the hills like a cool breeze before a storm, and as much as George wished for his days to stretch forever in this peaceful rhythm, walking with Martha, tending to Mount Vernon, listening to the soft breath of the forest, he knew that one day duty might call him once again. But for now, as firelight glowed on the walls and the house settled into nighttime silence, he held these moments close, and as he drifted to sleep with Martha nearby and the children safe in their rooms, his thoughts were warm and full of thanks for this gentle life. Thanks for the quiet peace, and thanks for this chapter with its deep, steady happiness. And under the sheltering dark of a winter sky scattered with bright stars, George Washington slept soundly, cradled by his home, his family, and a sense of purpose that was only just beginning to grow. Chapter 6. The Gathering Storm, 1775 to 1776. As George and Martha settled into their comfortable life at Mount Vernon, gentle days gave way to a deeper stirring, one that began like a distant whisper and slowly built into a steady breeze of change. Trouble was stirring across the colonies. Conversations in towns and letters from friends began to speak of new laws and taxes from across the ocean. of distant kings and parliaments, of freedoms questioned and hopes held close. And although George was happiest walking his green fields, checking his barns at dawn, and sharing supper with Martha and the children by the hearth, he listened carefully to these murmurs as they drifted into his home by 1775. The whispers had grown louder. Farmers and shopkeepers spoke in town about unfair taxes, and news came that men had already clashed with British troops at a small village called Lexington, far to the north. Each letter George read weighed on him like a quiet stone in his pocket. Night after night, as he sat in his chair by the fire and the house around him was hushed, his thoughts turned to his neighbors and to the people of the colonies. More than anything, George loved the quiet, honest life he had built with Martha at Mount Vernon, but he also felt a deep sense of duty, stirring like a breeze among the trees outside, and that sense of duty would not leave him. One warm spring morning, he received a letter summoning him to Philadelphia to attend the Continental Congress. Martha, who had always understood his heart, watched him read it with serious eyes. "You must go," she told him gently, hands folded in her lap. George nodded, taking her hands in his own. "And I will come back," he promised softly, and so he left their hilltop home once more, riding northward along the winding roads as new green buds unfurled on every branch and birds filled the skies with song. The Congress was held in a large brick hall surrounded by quiet streets and gentle gardens, but inside its rooms a different energy crackled. Delegates from every colony had gathered, men with bold ideas and brave hearts who wished to speak for the people they loved. And when they looked around the room and saw George among them, tall and thoughtful, with his steady gaze and quiet strength, they began to see him as a natural leader. When the time came to choose someone to lead the newly formed Continental Army, all eyes turned to him. George accepted this task with solemn grace. It was not fame or power he wanted, but to help his people and his home. And though his heart was heavy at leaving Martha and Mount Vernon behind, he knew that to do his part was the right path to take. And so, as summer unfolded in warm breezes and golden light, George donned his uniform and prepared to lead. He journeyed onward to Boston, where the army was gathered, a collection of farmers and tradesmen, most of them far from home for the first time. They were tired, hopeful, determined, and scared all at once. When they saw George ride into camp, he paused to look at each face, to see them not as an army, but as people with hopes and hearts, with hands that had worked fields and built homes, and he spoke to them simply, promising to stand by them, to do his best to lead them through every trial they would face. That gentle promise, spoken beneath a big summer sky, was one they would remember. The days became busy. George rose early each morning to inspect the troops, walking among the tents and greeting them with a kind word. He wrote letters home to Martha each evening by lantern light, telling her of his hopes and his worries, and at night, when all was still, he would step outside and look up at the vast dark sky. The stars glimmered overhead like tiny lanterns scattered across a quiet ocean of dark blue dot, and in those moments, he felt closer to home, as if Martha were looking up at the very same sky, thinking of him too. Seasons began to change, and the army dug in around Boston. Days were long and sometimes hard. Nights were filled with murmured stories and campfire light. Yet under George's patient leadership, they learned to trust one another and to grow strong together. And as they kept their careful watch over the hills and the town, they also began to believe that they could face whatever challenges would come with steady hands and steadfast hearts. As George looked across the camp one crisp autumn evening, he felt a quiet sense of purpose settle over him, like a gentle wind stirring the treetops. He thought of Mount Vernon, of the hills bathed in golden light, the warm fire glowing in the hearth, Martha and the children waiting for him at home. Though he missed them dearly, He knew that this was where he needed to be so, under the light of countless stars, with the soft breath of the sleeping army around him, and the distant hills dark against the night sky. George Washington closed his eyes, and he slept at last, gently and peacefully, his heart hopeful for the days yet to come. Chapter 7. The Darkest Winters, 1777-1778. As time passed, the gentle days of home and summer campfires gave way to harder seasons. The long road of war stretched onward, and one winter in particular would be remembered forever. A winter spent at a place called Valley Forge. By the time George led his army into this quiet Pennsylvania valley in the winter of 1777, the ground was already frozen hard. The trees had lost their green leaves and stood bare against a gray sky. Cold winds swept across the hills, and snowflakes began to dance in the chilly air as the soldiers made their camp. George knew this would not be an easy time. Supplies were short, food was scarce, warm clothing was worn thin, and many men had marched too far on feet that were tired and sore. And yet, as he walked the camp each morning with his dark cloak pulled tight around him, he greeted his men one by one. He listened to their stories, nodded at their small jokes, and looked into their eyes with steady care. Even when his hands were chilled to the bone, George kept his voice warm. "You're doing well," he would tell them gently. "We will get through this together." And they would smile at him with tired but grateful hearts, for in those quiet words was a strength that helped them go on. At night, George wrote long letters by candlelight in his little wooden quarters. The flames would dance across the walls as he wrote, first to Martha, telling her of his hopes and how much he missed home, and then to Congress, telling them what the army needed most and when the letters were sealed and the last candle was blown out, he would sit in the dark for a while, feeling the hush of the winter night outside. The snow fell soundlessly over the tents and cabins, blanketing the world in softness. Somewhere in the dark, a lone owl called, and George felt the weight of his duty as heavy and sure as the snow on the hills, but also gentle and pure, despite the hardships. The army held together. They built rough shelters to shield them from the wind and chopped wood for their fires. In the evenings, they told one another stories of home, of loved ones waiting far away, of the hills and streams they would return to once the war was won. And those gentle stories glowed like small lanterns in the dark, keeping their hearts warm as they drifted to sleep beneath their blankets. And when morning broke again, George was always there, strong and steady, walking among them with his sure gaze and a kind word. As winter deepened, new help began to arrive. Allies from across the ocean had come to offer training and encouragement. Supplies began to trickle in. The men practiced marching and learned new ways to fight. And slowly, as they worked side by side with hands and hearts united, a new strength took root, one that could face even the harshest winds with quiet determination. When George looked around the campfires at the men who had suffered so much and still stood ready to do their part, a gentle pride glowed in his chest. And when at last the snow began to melt and small green shoots appeared among the trees, Valley Forge was not just a place of struggle. It was a place of endurance, of patience, and of a shared belief that brighter days would come. As George sat one evening outside his cabin, listening to the faint murmur of the forest waking into spring, he thought of home, of Martha and Mount Vernon, of the gentle hills and warm summer light, and he hoped that one day, not too far away, they would all return to such quiet, peaceful places. Until then, he would do what he had always done, lead with a strong heart, a steady hand, and a gentle voice that reminded everyone they were never truly alone. And as the stars appeared one by one overhead, silver sparks scattered across a dark, calm sky, George let his eyes close at last, sleeping soundly as dreams of better days wrapped around him like a warm cloak against the winter chill. Chapter 8, Triumph and a Farewell to Arms, 1781 to 1783. As winter melted into spring and spring into summer, the days at Valley Forge became a distant memory, like footprints left behind on a snowy path. George and his army had grown stronger, not just in skill and discipline, but in spirit too. And though the war was long and hard, they carried a quiet determination, like a deep-running river that cannot be turned aside. By 1781, George and his troops had marched far and fought many battles across hills and fields, across green pastures and muddy roads. Letters flew back and forth across great distances, messages of courage and hope that kept him close to Martha, even when they were apart. And then, one warm autumn, came a moment that would forever be remembered: the siege of Yorktown. The skies over Virginia were painted in gold and pink as the days grew shorter. George and his French allies had surrounded the British forces near the sleepy town of Yorktown, closing in as gently and as firmly as the tide rises on the shore. Night after night, George walked the camp, his lantern lighting his way. As he greeted his soldiers, their tired faces glowing with quiet resolve. "You have all given so much," he told them warmly. "And soon, we will see this through together." And they believed him, for in his voice was the calm strength of a leader who had shared every hardship alongside them. When the final day came, there was hardly a sound but the rustle of the breeze and the gentle clinking of gear as the army took its positions. The world held its breath as George led his men forward, and at last, after days of careful work and careful waiting, the British surrendered, the green hills and golden trees witnessed a moment of quiet victory. Soldiers embraced one another, hands gripping shoulders and eyes bright with relief. Even George, as steady as an old oak, allowed himself a gentle smile as the reality sank in. And when the army returned home after that final triumph, George felt a different kind of pride, not loud or boastful, but deep and peaceful. He knew his task was nearly done, and so, in the winter of 1783, he gathered his men once more, this time not to fight, but to bid them farewell. The hall was warm and bright, but a hush fell over the room as George spoke. He thanked them, each and every one, for their courage, their loyalty, and their friendship. And though the parting was bittersweet, the men felt only respect and gratitude. They had followed him through dark winters and long marshes, and they would never forget the strength and gentleness of their commander. With his duties finally complete, George returned home to Mount Vernon at last. The hills and riverbanks greeted him like old friends as he rode up the path to his house. Martha was waiting at the door, her face glowing with a smile that spoke more than words ever could dot, and as George embraced her, the world felt right again, as though the gentle rhythm of his life was beginning once more. That night, they sat together by the fire as they had so many times before. The room glowed with soft light, and outside, the dark hills rose against a starry sky, and George felt a quiet joy in his heart, for though so much had changed, home was still the same warm and gentle place it had always been. And so, under the sheltering arms of his house and beneath the calm light of countless stars, George Washington let his eyes close at last, his dreams full of peace and his heart full of gentle, well-earned rest. Chapter 9, President of a New Nation, 178-91797. The years that followed George Washington's return to Mount Vernon were filled with a gentle, steady rhythm. Days began with birdsong and golden light spilling across the hills, and they ended with quiet evenings by the fire, Martha at his side. After the long years of war, these peaceful days felt like a treasure, yet beyond the hills, a new future was stirring, one that would call George back into service once again. The war was over, and a new nation was finding its feet. Delegates and leaders from across the colonies gathered to shape the United States' future. They needed a strong, trustworthy leader, someone who could guide them not with force, but with gentle strength and patience. And their thoughts kept returning to one name, George Washington Dot, when a messenger came to Mount Vernon bearing the news that he had been elected the first president of the United States. George felt a deep sense of responsibility settle gently upon him like a cloak. He had hoped for a quiet life at home, but he knew his duty, and so, with a warm farewell to Martha and the gentle hills of Mount Vernon, he set out once more, this time not to fight, but to lead and to serve. He traveled slowly to New York City, where the new capital had been set up. The journey was like a long goodbye to one chapter of his life and a careful hello to the next. Every town he passed greeted him warmly. Farmers waved from their fences. Shopkeepers paused their work to bow politely. Children ran alongside, his carriage laughing and cheering. And as George gazed out at their smiling faces, he felt the weight of his task and the quiet, hopeful trust they placed in him. The ceremony of his inauguration was held on a bright morning in April of 1789. The breeze was gentle, and the rooftops of the city glowed warmly in the sunshine as crowds gathered in the streets. George took his oath of office with a calm voice and a steady heart, and as he stood there, hands on the Bible, the whole city seemed to hold its breath, as though they were listening to a promise whispered gently on the morning air. That promise was one of service, one of patience, one of steady hands on the helm of a fragile new nation. As president, George embraced his work with quiet determination. Every morning, he rose early and read letters from every corner of the new country, messages from farmers and shopkeepers, from lawmakers and soldiers, from friends and strangers alike, and every day he met with his cabinet, wise and capable. Men like Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson, discussing trade, laws, and treaties by candlelight. At night, when the house grew still, George would take a quiet walk along the garden paths. The gentle rustle of the trees and the glimmer of moonlight on the rooftops felt like a gentle reminder of all they had fought for. And in these moments of stillness, George would often close his eyes and remember Mount Vernon, hearing the gentle sound of the Potomac River and Martha's voice calling him home. Years passed, and George guided the nation with careful hands, setting examples that would last long after he was gone. He believed in honesty and fairness. He spoke with respect and listened with patience. And most of all, he kept his heart focused on serving those who had entrusted him with this great responsibility. And when the time finally came to leave the presidency and return home, it was with a sense of gentle fulfillment, like closing the last page of a much-loved book. That final day in office was filled with quiet goodbyes, a handshake with his successor, a nod to the crowds who had gathered outside to wish him well. And as his carriage rolled slowly away from the city, past green hills and sleepy villages, George felt his heart grow lighter with every mile that brought him closer to Mount Vernon. And at long last, as the sun painted the hills golden once more, he crossed the familiar wooden bridge and rode up the path to his home. And there was Martha, waiting for him on the porch with a gentle smile. And there were the hills, green and welcoming, and the river blue and shining in the light. And in that quiet moment, George Washington felt the deep peace of a life well lived, like a warm breeze at the end of a gentle day, carrying him home at last. Chapter 10, A Gentle Farewell, 1797 to 1799. And so George Washington returned once more to his beloved home at Mount Vernon, where the hills greeted him like old friends, and the broad Potomac River sparkled softly in the morning light. The years of war and leadership were behind him now. Every morning, as he rose with the sun, George felt a quiet joy at simply being home, tending his gardens, walking his pastures, and sharing gentle conversations with Martha by the fire in the evenings. Each day unfolded like a slow, beautiful melody. The house was full of warm light and familiar scents, bread baking in the kitchen, the faint perfume of flowers from the gardens, the distant sound of a horse nickering in the stables. George would rise before dawn to make his rounds, his boots crunching softly on the gravel paths. Sometimes the morning mist still clung to the hillsides, turning the world silver and hushed as if wrapped in a sleepy dream dot, and as the sun climbed higher into the blue sky, the hills glowed green and gold, full of gentle life. In the evenings, Martha and George would sit together on the porch, hands clasped, watching the fireflies twinkle across the meadow like tiny lanterns. Their children and grandchildren would come to visit, filling the house with laughter and gentle chatter, bringing news of their own lives and hopes. And George listened with a quiet smile, his heart full as he watched the firelight dance across their faces. The world outside was changing. The new nation he had helped to guide was growing strong and sure, and George felt a quiet pride knowing that his part in its story was complete. He had never wished for fame or power, only to do his best with honesty and care. And now, at last, his days were his own again, to live simply, surrounded by those he loved. When the nights grew colder and the days grew short, George often took up his chair by the fire, reading a favorite book or simply listening to the quiet hush of the house. And sometimes, as he sat there in the glow of the flames, his thoughts would drift far beyond the walls to the misty hills of his boyhood, the campfires of his soldiering days, the gardens of Valley Forge in spring, and the long, proud halls where he had taken his oath as president. Each chapter of his life had been like a leaf turning gently in the wind, stirring, then settling, then moving onward with quiet grace. And as the years softened to gentle memories, George Washington knew in his heart that he had followed his path as truly as he could. And one peaceful December evening in 1799, as a gentle snow began to fall outside the windows of Mount Vernon, George lay down to rest one final time, surrounded by those who loved him, wrapped in warmth and light. And all across the hills and forests he had cherished, a deep hush settled, as if the whole world paused to say a soft, grateful farewell. And so ends the story of George Washington, a boy who loved his home and his family, who walked his path with patience and strength, and who left a gentle light that would last forever. And as you close your eyes tonight, may you feel that light too, like a friendly star in a quiet sky, watching over you as you drift into a gentle, peaceful sleep. Thank you for listening to the story of George Washington. Wishing you the sweetest of dreams. Good night and sleep well.